Hey, good morning.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello there.
Hey,
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. How are you? There it is. Audio. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Definitely well-combed hair. You know.
The agenda is pretty light today, I think. If y'all haven't had a chance to add stuff, please add what you want to talk about in the meeting agenda.
How was everybody's holidays?
It was good.
yeah,
I'm just looking through the linked chat here for the logs thing.
I'm just listening to the wind howling.
Oh no, is it windy where you're at?
Yeah. Pretty windy.
I think it's going to rain starting very soon.
There's an advisory saying don't travel unnecessarily.
Yeah, the storm is coming.
I love how the advice is like, oh, don't drive into the flood, back out. But it's like, it's not possible to do that if you're out like on a freeway or like there's like traffic, you can't back out. Yeah.
You're like, yeah, here's the keys.
You don't back up on the freeway? Huh. No, just kidding.
Funny, funny. All right, shall we start?
I guess.
I mean, just to give folks an update on the release, maybe. Sertaj, you want to do that?
Yeah, I opened the PR yesterday. I think everybody approved it. Yeah, so I'm going to, yeah, I got an approval from Rita and Max. I'm gonna merge it right after this call and then cut the tag, assuming we don't have anything else we want to get it in 3.11.0. Or we can always cut a patch release too. Yeah, and then I think I need to remember to cut a 3.12.beta.0 to just align all the stuff. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Cool. Thanks for doing all that.
Mhm.
Okay, if there's nothing else, we can talk about the next item. I just thought this was interesting. Like, I'm not really looking for any like decisions or anything. I think that this is just kind of an FYI. So if you open that thread, someone was actually looking for ways to, I think, see additional logs in Gatekeeper when it calls out to external data. I thought it was a good feedback in that, you know, even with tracing, it's pretty hard to get any valuable things from that, because all you get is like the, let me see, yeah, all you get is like external data keys and then like the local 3 local whatever variables and then the provider. So nothing really useful, I think. Obviously providers can add logs on their end, but I think this is more coming from Gatekeeper, right? So that's why I tagged Anders asking if, like, how does HTTP send, you know, how does that do it today? And I don't think there's a way, not that I can tell. He did suggest decision logs, and I looked at it a little bit, but that seems like a lot. Because once you turn on decision logs, it's like all or nothing kind of thing. Whereas like in this case, I can sort of see as an operator, I may want to see like, hey, what were the external data calls that were made, right? As part of any policy.
Oh, sorry. I thought this was expansion templates this whole time. Sorry, it's just sinking in.
No, that's another bug.
Too early for the West Coast.
But it's just funny because you were like looking at it for a bit. Yeah, I don't know.
So
Thoughts?
what is asked is logs that, hey, something is getting cold.
Like, you know how our, like the external data built-in function today does the handshake, right? Between like Rego and the web request, right? The
Mhm.
external request, like that, it would be nice to get logs for that, right?
So one is, hey, I sent something, and then assuming the provider says, hey, I received something,
Right.
and then the gatekeeper to say, okay, I received something from the provider. Is that it?
Right. Or like what were the actual endpoint that was called, right?
But we don't want to probably list the things that are getting called with.
Right. Like, so you, again, like log level and what you actually log is TBD. But my point is, I don't even think there's an easy way to log it today.
Okay,
Right.
yeah, I think we can add a log. Shouldn't
Yeah,
But
I mean,
because this is in OPA. Mhm.
well, fortunately, it's not just an OPA, right? We have control over some of
yeah.
the Golang once it offloads to our
But
built-in.
isn't built-in something that is OPA? Like OPA sees it, right?
I mean, that part is OPA. I mean, sorry, the built-in is actually Go.
The built-in we wrote, the external data built-in is coded in Go.
Yeah.
The registering of the built-in and the part where someone writes, built-in name, provides arguments, all that's handled in Rego and the Rego engine. But once control is passed off to our Golang code, we could do whatever we want.
I see. But does that, but isn't that getting called by OPA? Meaning, how do I surface that log?
So because we could do whatever we want, we could like write to a file, we could call out to a web service, we can update Prometheus metrics, we can, I don't know, publish to pub sub queue. Literally whatever we could do anywhere else, we could do here, with the caveat that somehow we need to have whatever data and handles available to do that, right? Like I'm thinking of for the caching, right? How we spent some time figuring out how to pass the cache into
Right.
the external data code.
Okay. So you're saying the built-in isn't actually like if let's say if I add logging for in the built-in, that is not something that is actually outside of OPA.
Right. Yeah, we could add logging all day. Could and should,
Okay.
however.
For some
are-
reason, I thought the built-in is like called, it is like inside of OPA for some reason.
I
It's in
think
frameworks.
it's what?
It's in frameworks. We just
It's
register
in
it.
frameworks, but
Yeah.
it's called by OPA, right?
Right.
So
It's called by OPA, but once it's called by OPA, we now own the execution time.
Yeah.
Right.
who
OPA
owns the
delegates
the
control.
logger?
That depends on the logging system for us because the log is a global variable. We would.
Okay. All right. I could test this out. Yeah. I thought for some reason, and this is again why I'm asking is I thought that would have to be written to OPA's logging mechanism.
Mm.
Yeah. And I
I
was
mean,
like, how does that even work? Okay.
yeah, worst case, we'd have to pass log into context. Right. The same thing, the same trick as with the cache.
Right. I see.
That being said, we probably don't want to log by default.
Right, for
Just
sure.
because of expense. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, kind of like the tracing thing, like you would enable it as a flag. Yeah.
Because the overhead would potentially.
Got
I
it.
mean, these are HTTP requests we're sending out, so like proportionally the cost might not be so bad. Because we're waiting on a response latency anyway. But then again, if it's like running on the local host, I don't know what's faster. It depends on if you have a spinning disk, I'd imagine, and the log buffering and all that.
So you're saying I could try to write the log to use context to log things?
I'm saying that the only potential problem we have with logging something is access to that log variable that we use, right? Log
Mhm.
dot blah blah blah.
Mhm.
If I remember right, logging tends to be a package level variable, However, that's in Gatekeeper. I don't think we use, and I might be wrong about this, logging infrastructure in constraint framework.
I mean,
can't
this logger would need to be in framework, yeah.
Right. Well, framework would need access to a logger.
Right.
And I think the reason to not use a logger in constraint framework is that you don't necessarily want libraries to take control of logging, because as a caller, what if you're using a different log service, right? We see this in Gatekeeper with occasionally, very occasionally, there's logs written in different format than JSON output, right? Because they're using some logger we don't have any control over. A potential solution to that would be to pass a logger on creation or similar, right? In which case logger could live as a member variable of some kind of struct, right? That houses the external data built in as well. All right, and you could just construct it that way. Or maybe it's fine to use an external logger. Maybe there's a way to set a global variable, kind of like how the logging system does. There's a couple of different ways of doing this. But yeah, that's the main challenge.
Hmm.
Metrics could also be interesting. We definitely would want to be even more conservative with metrics in terms of like what information we're handing out. But having statistics around these are the number of external data requests that resulted in error or something like that could be good for diagnosing. Let's say there's a network partition, right? Like even if the provider is exporting Prometheus metrics, it's not going to know it received a call to report an error. So also having those metrics server side can be helpful.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, that might be, I'm just seeing the buzz thing. Does that get rid of it?
I don't think it's you, Max. I
Okay.
think you were earlier. So you were muted earlier, and it was still buzzing.
Oh.
It's weird.
I hear no buzz for what it's worth.
Yeah, I do too, actually.
Now the buzz is gone and radio noise is there for me.
Rita, are you going to open an issue for the logs?
Yeah, I was thinking we should, right? Like, I feel like it'd be good to have that. Or what do y'all think?
Yeah, I think definitely good to have it. So
Yeah.
I think we just need to decide on like what is the level, what to log, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, another possibility could be rather than logging, it's part of the tracing feature, right? That could be also interesting because that would let you know where in the OPA execution also it's happening.
You mean enable tracing?
Right, or when users enable tracing, if they happen to be using external data adds some spice to the trace back or the tracing that it receives. I don't know how possible that is.
Yeah, so that's what I asked this user to do, is to enable tracing, and that's how he got this back, right? And this that I'm just putting in the chat. But again, this is not very like,
Yeah, local 3, local 10,
yeah.
not very helpful. One thing that
I mean,
we-
this is good because at least you see what provider they're calling, but it doesn't give us like more information as far as like what was the actual endpoint or whatever, right?
Right, and we know that users could add another trace call in Rego that where they
Mm.
give local 3 and local 10, though they'd be the actual variable names in terms of how they wrote it as an argument. Right, it's like trace, printf, %v, %v.
The like the
Local
print thing, you mean?
variable. Yeah.
Okay.
And that would manually give them
Sure.
the contents.
But that wouldn't be something you put in production for sure, right? So,
No,
right.
like you
Whereas
wouldn't
like,
trace in
mhm,
production.
right. Whereas like the logging thing I was thinking about is more for perhaps like, if you have a bug in production, you can turn it on and you will actually get that verbose logging.
Yeah, I think that they're separate things, right? Logs and then the tracing. Yeah.
Right. I was just saying that doesn't address the concern I had earlier. Like
I don't.
adding the print. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would be concerned enabling logging in production. It could be fine, or it could push the server over. Right. It just depends on how expensive
Mm,
logging happens to be. Uh, I mean, we could do both. I that neither of those are saying like one of these are better in principle than the other, but I'm just saying with the in production comment, um, I would tend to hold either of these carefully in production if I was turning them on.
mhm.
Um, yeah, metrics is gonna be the lightest weight there, just because updating a memory thing is cheaper. Another trick that people tend to do is log sampling, right? So either they write out like an aggregated log every so often, or they randomly log, right, like every 10th time if they're expecting like a high volume of logs, or you could batch the logging is another trick you could do, right, where everything gets logged and maybe you log the first one but then you log every 10th one after that, things like that, or you log 10 at a time after the first one. There's different ways of throttling how often you log to disk. All this is maybe premature optimization, but if you're thinking about recommending people have it in production, those are ways to minimize the cost.
Mm. You were saying metrics is better.
Well, metrics is more performance, right? But it's going to be less information dense,
Right.
and it's going to be more performant and more instant, right? And you could hook an alert up to it, right? Someone could say, whenever there's an external data failure, send me an alert. They're not going to know necessarily which external data
Right.
entry is failing, but
Or like what was the exact endpoint that was called? Like, so for like I guess like the scenario I'm looking at is more for debugging, right? If your policy isn't working properly, how do you debug this, right? So I think tracing is like the easiest one to start. I forgot about the print thing. So we could try that first since that's not going to require us to add a code, I guess, right?
yeah, and then tracing already has mechanisms where users can selectively enable it per request, which should make it safer to run in production
Hmm,
at the cost of it being a little bit more finicky to actually get working.
right. I forgot, how does the printing work in this case? It you can print the local variable, the locals?
It's something like I'm typing into the terminal here. Percent v string one, two. Ignore my horrible naming. Close the parentheses. I might be getting the function names slightly wrong. Like,
Mhm.
forget if it's sprintf or not, but that's roughly.
I see.
So they don't need to put like local 3, local 10. That's just like post compilation optimization where Rego rewrites variable names.
Right.
They would use the actual names of the variables in their Rego code.
Mm,
So, and I would actually trace the variables passed to external data. And then I would also, in a second statement, just in case external data is where execution stops, add a trace for the response.
mm, makes sense. Okay. We should document this. Yeah, like
How,
something,
how to annotate your Rego?
or like just trace or debugging, I guess. I think we have a I'm looking at our debugging thing. We do mention tracing, like for how to turn on.
Yeah, but not like tips and tricks for how
Yeah,
to.
exactly. Not like here's like some sprints that you can I mean, we kind of do have the sprint thing, like sprintf in the Rego itself, obviously, but not the trace bit.
Yeah, and honestly, this is 90% of how, if there's ever a bug in Rego, I put traces everywhere. And
Right.
yeah,
But I mean, you don't even need trace, right? You can just sprintf all your
oh no, you need trace. What the trace command does
Mhm.
is it puts it into the trace.
Oh,
Right.
right. Yeah. Like in framework and in OPA, it turns on the tracing thing, right?
No, so that's separate. So
Oh,
this trace Rego command, what it
mhm.
does is if you were to turn on trace,
I see.
you would see vals and then some variable contents.
Got it.
So you'd be able to, instead of local 3, actually know what local 3 is.
Mhm. Okay. So then you can trace the input and output, the rate, the input, the request and the response. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let me suggest for that person to try this and see if that meets their requirement. If so, then maybe that's good enough for what they want to do right now.
Yeah, the ongoing monitorings of external data and the logging stuff, I think, is still interesting, but for them, yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Anything else?
I just tagged 311 by the way, so it should be out shortly.
Okay, cool. Nice.
And please approve the 12 beta 0 PR.
DCO,
Yeah.
our friend.
There's a PR to approve for 311.
12.
312.
Okay, gotcha. Oh, we're 2 releases away from the Pi release.
Hey, can we get it in like March, maybe? That would be cool.
I mean, we can. We
Like
do
on
keep
March 14th. Like that would be cool.
I mean, we can definitely get a beta or something out. I don't know if
Yeah.
the regular releases align with that.
Sweet. Oh, there was also like Max, the PR about like adding additional logging mechanism, right?
Yeah,
Right.
the log to a different file. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I was reading, I mean, I get your point about the end-to-end tests getting like bloated. But at the same time, like I think in KK, right, the way it's done is, I guess there are certain jobs that you can run like when you trigger it. So it's not part of the like the pre-submit tests all the like EDEs all the time. But the nice thing is like, if someone changes something, at least we can trigger it to know it didn't break anything. I'm not sure how to do that, but
Yeah, I mean, so if you take the surface area kind of being infinite argument for granted, right? Which it sounds like you do take that at face value, that we don't want to like end-to-end test all configuration permutations, because there are like millions. I did the math for just looked at the Helm chart configurations and assumed there's 2 options for every knob.
yeah, we definitely don't have all the permutations, but we do have at least like the flags enabled so that we can test the features if they were turned on, if that makes sense.
Well, that's the permutations bit, right? Like, and that's that binary assumption, right? Like, do they break if they're turned on? Do they break if they're turned off? Do they break in some combination of like these 3
Yeah.
being turned on? All that. But I mean, it sounds like I was persuasive there that just it's not feasible to test all of those, so you find the riskiest ones.
I mean, today we don't have all the permutations. I'm saying I agree we don't have all the permutations today. Yeah.
My argument is we don't want to have all the permutations.
Right, right.
Okay.
And my argument is we just need some way to make sure this feature works. Instead of relying on the PR owner to say, oh, I've tested this.
And so if we did have something like running the end-to-end tests that's manually triggered, there's maybe 2 options here, right? I mean, there's probably more, but you said an option, I could think of another option, right? If we manually just run end-to-end tests when we want to, that's always possible. If we have something like, let's pretend you put a comment on the PR that runs the end-to-end tests, And let's say we get real fancy with it and we could provide whatever flags we want to be set in the comment when we're running the end-to-end tests. One, like, is that much different than us just manually running the end-to-end tests, or if we decide it's warranted with a specific configuration? It's maybe more convenient, maybe more visible, right? That something was run, so it's not unvaluable, but in terms of likelihood of it happening, I think you're about at the same probability, maybe a little higher with the comment situation, because it's maybe easier to do. But the other half of that would be the end-to-end tests wouldn't necessarily be guaranteed to succeed with other configurations, right? Like, just for example, let's say we turn mutation off. The mutation end-to-end test would fail, and for good reason, right? Mutation's not on. So in some ways, the testing that we write is coupled to the configuration of the binary. All things being equal, it is better to have more test coverage. I'm just very cognizant of cost benefit, right? And what's the cost of writing this infrastructure? How often will it be run? How likely is it to be run? Versus how often is a given configuration used? What's the cost if there is a problem? What's the likelihood that there will be a problem? And also, what kind of users, let's say, are using it, right? Like, if it's something that fails loudly, right? Or something that people know to, when they update, make sure this is happening, such that they just don't update and they file an issue. That's another way of kind of being safe about it, but not attempting to query the universe, the infinite paths that the execution can take.
I mean, I guess like the other way I would look at it is like if this were a new flag that was introduced or new feature that's introduced, like how do we know it's working if there's no E to E?
Right. And this is where the cost benefit analysis comes in, right? For something like expansion templates or external data or stuff where there's a significant amount of new code, right? One, end-to-end tests do tend to get written for those. Two, we tend to assume that those are on, right? We don't tend to test how the binary behaves when those features are disabled. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. In fact, I would argue that we would get more value out of testing something like the external data being, well, external data, we're already testing it off because it's data, I forget. But, or expansion templates or mutation testing with those features off, because we are disabling fairly large subsets of the application's functionality, right? And there's some risk that we've coupled some critical behavior to those features. Like, you can imagine status, right? If we got the granularity wrong there and status stopped working for mutation. For something like logs, because it is contained 100% in a single file, and because really the thing that it's changing is it's opening a file and passing that value to a library, which has its own testing and its own release process, all of that, which we should have faith in, right? Because delegation of concerns. The number of uh, vectors for something to go wrong is much lower. And that's where I get that decreased risk, right?
Yeah, so like in this case, because it's an optional flag and it writes a log file, the risk is low, is your point.
Yeah, that all we're doing is we're changing literally the argument passed to the log constructor by using this flag or not using this flag.
Right. Okay. I guess, yeah, the reason I'm asking is just to figure out like, hey, is there like a process for when we require something to be included in the E2E by default? And I think what I'm hearing is any feature flag that could potentially be turned on by default should really be turned on, right? Like, so we know they're not going to, if something breaks it, we will know right away.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've proposed any hard criteria. I don't think there is one. I can say the mere existence of a flag probably doesn't warrant a new E2E test. I think if you do add a large feature, right, testing it on by default, definitely valuable. It could be, if we only get to choose one value because we've decided, well, really, we just want to make sure this logic path gets exercised, whether we test it with a default value or a custom value. I think that would be a judgment call based off of the the relative risk that we see. An example of this would be the namespace that Gatekeeper runs in, right? Do we test that Gatekeeper runs well when it's running outside of the Gatekeeper system namespace? I forget if the default end-to-end namespace is modified or not, but it could be interesting to modify it. Under the assumption that, well, if someone's running stuff locally, right, they're gonna install it. If they're developing and testing and they're doing that cycle, they're probably using the Gatekeeper system namespace, because why would you use something different? And then testing the less used functionality and end to end, there's arguments for the reverse. Does that make sense? It's not very clarifying, but it's an example of.
I mean, it makes sense. I guess like I'm just trying to establish some standard. I know it's hard, but since we're looking at this, mine as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we can maybe establish standards for when we ought to be looking at end-to-end tests, but I don't know if we can be prescriptive about the shape those end-to-end tests should take, right? Like whether we should be testing with the flag on or off or with a special value, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And I would think I am a little bit nervous to get like too prescriptive with the like uh, observable criteria, just because I'm afraid I would get it wrong, right? Like you could imagine, oh, if it touches more than 3 separate packages, then you should have an end-to-end test because it's like going in, it's hitting multiple areas of the program. It's like, well, maybe, but I've not. I'm sure I could come up with some examples where, you know, do we really need to do that? And the thing I would mostly look for would be risk, right? How likely is it that someone else is going to do something that breaks the feature? How likely is it that this feature is going to get changes down the road such that we would want it to be automatically tested? How likely is it that a change to an upstream library could break the feature? And yeah,
That's fair.
uh, can you think of any like concrete observables that would let us know that?
I think usually I use the issues queue as a way signal to tell us like, hey, users are getting a lot of errors for something, and it might mean that we have bad test coverage, right?
Yeah.
Like say, I don't know, I'm just picking on this because it's fresh, like a newer issue, like the expended resource thing. That sounds like a bug, right? So my question will be, why didn't our tests catch it, right? So that might be a gap in the EDE possibly, because I don't think we have, not that I'm aware of, I don't know if we have good expended
Expansion template. We definitely, I
test in the EDE.
yeah, I think we test mutation for sure. I forget if we test validation. It could also be we test validation, but because that field got clobbered and
Right.
defaults to all, we don't test the negative case where
Right.
it's not
Right.
expected to work.
Yes.
And maybe we want to do that. Maybe the lesson there is actually the brittleness was we have 2 sources of truth, right? For the schema for the mutation or for the batch criteria, and we should
Yes.
not do that because that's, you know, if he could have if the author could have updated the match criteria schema where the in the struct and then auto generated the JSON schema, like we do with all CRD generation, right? And we just check to make sure that there's no pending changes as a blocking release. That also could be a way of reducing that, and also would have the benefit of future errors of that kind would no longer be possible, right? Um, maybe we also write an end-to-end test for that situation because it's relatively cheap because we're already installing stuff with that config. That's just to give you some sense of how I see that particular situation vis-a-vis like trying to prevent something similar from happening in the future.
Okay. Anyone else have any opinion about this? Okay, well, if nothing else, I don't think there's any other topic.
Hey there, this is Alex. I joined a little bit late because I thought this was 2 p.m. Happy New Year's, everyone. I have 2 questions. Shertash, I don't want to put you on the spot, but one of the cooler meetings that I think I had here last year was when we were talking about multi-action. So I just wanted to ask you, like, are you planning on holding another forum to talk about the design doc over there, or?
Oh, the one we talked about, the constraint template.
Yeah,
Sorry, the constraint, the enforcement actions.
yes.
Yeah, I think we need to go back and check. I don't remember the status about that. Maybe we can move it to the next week. So we have another review and then we can make a final decision.
Gotcha. Yeah, of course. I'm not trying to put you on the spot and be like, let's do it now. I was just like I thought that I think that's something that would really benefit our project from. So I'm excited about that.
Max, did you have any thoughts about that one? I know you added some of the options.
Yeah, I definitely want to see the thread keeping going. To me, the moving target here is the cell cap, right? And wanting to be sure we don't accidentally shoot ourselves in the foot with regard to having the stuff that we would do in Gatekeeper also being expressible in the cell cap, right? If it's not possible to translate between the two, then our story for it being sort of easy to use both and Gatekeeper is kind of your friendly interface to that other enforcement mechanism. That whole story gets complicated. And if that gets complicated, right, then we run the risk of people just not using us in favor of the cell cap. So that in terms of the timing of this and the specific design, that's top of my mind. That doesn't yield a specific result. Like if we were to discuss something, it's just something once we have specifics, I would want to sort of compare where we're at between the two to figure out, is it compatible based on what we know and based on changes we know are happening to the cell cap? Is there anything we should be waiting on?
Yeah, sounds good. I put it on the next week's agenda, so just so we remember it.
Yeah. But it is something I would like to to see for sure, because I think it would unblock a lot of cool stuff. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on the cell cap stuff vis-a-vis enforcement action?
Who's your question to Max?
Just generally, I was thinking you, but like anyone, if anyone has thoughts, be interested to hear them.
I think I need to go back and revisit that one, and then see how would it work with these changes.
Yeah, I think the main thing is we should be able to know without knowing the inbound request which enforcement actions we would want to take. Because the cell cap, like generally speaking, because it's the API server taking the enforcement action, and because they have at least currently a static enforcement action, right? It's either deny or warn, I think, or maybe it's only deny right now. There's a little bit of like leaving the bike shedding for future, just to get consensus in the original cell cap. But if the goal is to take a constraint template and a constraint and rewrite them to be cell cap resources, if users want that enforcement on the cell cap side, right, then we need to be able to perform that static analysis so we can make that transformation. However, I don't think that means we're limited to just the enforcement actions that the CellCap supports, right? Like, because audit would still be run by Gatekeeper, right? And maybe audit wants to do some of these fancier stuffs we're contemplating. Maybe even webhook based, right? Maybe for the CellCap, the answer is, well, if you're using an enforcement action that on API server enforcement just can't do, right? It's possible for us to either use both, right? And on API server enforcement does the things that it can do, or we just don't use that particular constraint with on API server enforcement. And therefore you're able to push things to your messaging queue or whatever the fancy enforcement actions are we want to implement. Bye, Thomas. Yeah, so that's the most specific I could get for what I'm thinking about. And then the other elements would be just once we know what we want to do, I'd probably do a round of engaging with the people with the CellCap to see what are the likely range of outcomes for their design. And that would be a good litmus test for how risky us doing anything would be versus knowing what we want to do and waiting until it's clearer that it's okay to do. Does that make sense?
Looks like we are on time. Any last minute topics? Good. Nothing. Okay, cool. Nice to see everybody.
Bye.
Nice to see you.
Have a good week. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.